Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to speak to you for the next 20 minutes, and that, of course, is only for the warm-up of the conversation that Oren and Karen and I will have after my talk. And it's pretty nice, pretty amazing actually to be here and to see old friends who knew from my Seattle days, like Alex sitting here, all the way to recent students like Rihan over there in the back. What I'm going to talk to you about in the next 20 minutes is three things. One, I'm showing you how a company you all know, and I know as well, namely Amazon, what Amazon is actually doing with data and how that has shifted over the last 15 years. I will then talk a bit about the principle give to get, which is also the principle which I think I want to write the book about. And then at the end, I'll just end with a couple of rules on how I think we should be thinking about data and APIs. So let's go back a bit in history. In the 70s, people learned how to build computers. In the 80s, it was about connecting computers. The 90s was about connecting pages, not pages, as Paul said last night from Intel. And the 2000s was about connecting people. Now, this decade is, of course, Internet of Things. It's about connecting sensors. I also have a house in China, and I'll be there later this month. And when I typically ask people at the end of a talk, what were the most important things you took with you? People typically say they're connecting sensors, but they spell it with a C. So the world we live in really is characterized by having an amazing proxy that all of us carry with us, and it is the mobile phone. So what I'm interested in is really social, local, mobile. What do you touch more often than your phone? And the phone is truly a two-way device. My phone reports my geolocation 24/7. And in this talk, I invite you to think about a couple of things. One of them is, if your geolocation was known 24/7, if you could API into it, what would you do with that? Now, what about if your partner's geolocation was known 24/7, or your competitors, or your enemies? So here is my simple life. I live in San Francisco, actually within walking distance from here. Every now and then I drive to Stanford to teach. Every now and then I go to Berkeley. And what you can see here is how, based on the data other people create, I make my decision whether I take 101 or 280. So what is a data refinery? Data refinery is something that takes the data out in the world, and my interest is mainly for social data, data people create and share, and refines it to help you make a better decision. So let's talk about this in a little bit of detail here. Well, if I want to know, should I take this route or that route, then typically I need to share where I am and where I want to go. Because if I don't tell, let's say, Google where I want to go, then it's hard for Google to tell me whether 101 or 280 is the better route. Now, my digital exhaust, of course, is where I am at any given point in time. In the 90s, I was a postdoc at Xerox PARC, and we had connection machines, pretty much the best computers at the time, to compute the traffic situation. And the example was 101 versus 280. Is the traffic going to be linear, or is it going to be turbulent, i.e., traffic jam? So we had a world where we made lots of assumptions how cars are flowing and little data. I mean, how much did we know at the time how the traffic was moving? People actually still used to have maps. You know what maps were? Now, No need for complicated models. All we need to do is observe cars or observe people in cars, observe their mobile phones. And we don't need all of them. We just need a few. And based on that data, as opposed to based on the model, we can make better decisions. Now, Google here with Latitude, which was phased out, if somebody has an idea about any API which would help me to take my Google data out and display them on a website, I'm in the market for that. It also knows where I'm eating. And it's pretty well known the best two places for at least free food in the Bay Area, of course, are Facebook and Google. But Oren asked me to spend a few minutes to talk about Amazon and to talk about what Amazon, where without lab coat, I was working with Jeff Bezos, bringing scientific method experimentation to Amazon, about what we did. So Jeff's goal always was helping people make better decisions. So Amazon actually is a data refinery. And the next few minutes I will show you what data Amazon took over the years and how it was refined to this goal, to helping people make better decisions. The data strategy there was to make it trivially easy for people to contribute, to connect with each other, and to collaborate. So let's talk about recommendations. There are 5 stages in which recommendations developed. Product discovery, pre-Amazon, was done manually by people putting things together, for instance, in a Sunday paper ad, for those people who still have newspapers. So it was manually done, it didn't scale. There was no way for it to actually be automatic. In the next stage, we had implicit data. Implicit data are the data, the digital exhaust, which you necessarily leave as you communicate, as you interact with the website. So how would Amazon be able to give you details about a product if you didn't click on that product and tell Amazon that you want to know more about it? Or how would poor Google be able to tell you whatever you want to know if you weren't sharing the search term with Google? So those are implicit data. In the case of Amazon, and you all know that example, it's a big matrix which gets filled by co-clicking behavior. So if within a session you click on item I and item J, then that cell, Aij, gets incremented by 1. Now, what that means is that when somebody tells you it's people like you, that's not really the case. It's just people who happen to have been in a similar situation and clicking on one item, afterwards clicking on another item, and we project that out to you. So that here was the second point. The third one is explicit data. That allowed people to write to the website. That's pretty amazing if you think about branding and controlling the content. Amazon, more than 10 years ago, encouraging people to actually write to the website, reviews. Think about the last few items you bought. What influenced your purchasing decision? And I think for most of us, it is one of those things that was either implicit data, where it says people looked at this item, eventually bought that item. So it can't be all that stupid. Or it could be explicit data where you read reviews. In many cases, explicit data tied together with the identity of the reviewer, where you can sort of get a feeling about whether they are just fake or whether they are real, and if they are real, whether they like you or whether they are very different. The two things which came since, and we are basically starting with, is situation, which is local information. Knowing in this room, there are hundreds of sensors in this room. We all have mobile phones which have a bunch of sensors. We know the quality of our voice. Stuff that, 20 years ago used to be top secret. The CIA having lie detectors. Now you can buy for 99 cents in the App Store. So what actually does this do to understand the situation you were in? Are we excited? Do we have time? Do we want to learn more about a product, or is it for our mother-in-law and anything will do as long as we arrive on time? So that is situation. And the last point is the social graph. So Amazon actually had a social network before there was Facebook. The only problem was nobody really went there. But the idea that social commerce is something which Amazon wanted to develop goes really way back. And it was called Share the Love. Does anybody remember that? Okay. So that tells you how fast, things get forgotten. Let me tell you about it. Here's how it worked. After you bought an item, you were asked, do you have any friends who you might want to share that item you just bought with? And if they buy, or at least one of your friends buys that item within a week, you get 10% discount, and they also get 10% discount on the item. So the idea was to unveil or to discover the social graph, how people are connected, who influences whom. But our mindset wasn't there yet. So the conversion rate where we had it was pretty amazing because the 4 C's of commerce were all picked by the individual. I bought a book, the content. I provide the context, namely that I bought the book. I pick who of my friends I want to inform. I pick the connection, and it serves as a starter for a conversation. So what we have seen is that traditional view that marketing addresses an audience pretty much has been replaced by marketing addressing connected individuals. It's a very different shift. If you have an API that tries to figure out who to send what to, it used to be properties of the person, Axiom, Experian, and all these companies that provide you with attributes about an individual. I can happily talk later about examples where when we just know the metadata, who connects with whom, like phone calls, like email headers, that's much more powerful, the graph between people, for knowing who influences whom than trying to figure it out from properties about the person. So to summarize, in the first half, I talked about 3 things: how we moved from e-business, company in the center, to me business, individual in the center, to we business, connection between individuals being in the center. All of it is based on data. So I really only had time here to talk about how Amazon and other e-business companies have changed the way 1 billion people think about purchasing things. The other 2 examples, of course, would be how Google changed the way how 1 billion people think about information, and how Facebook changed the way how 1 billion people think about themselves and their relations to others. It really is a global culture shift. And we live in this pretty amazing time where the world got connected irreversibly so. It's worth reflecting on that. So, why does Google spend money on glass? Think about it from a data perspective. Every person who wears Google Glass now acts as a sensor who measures out the universe for Google. So as you're walking through your favorite grocery store, weighted by your attention, by your interest, you look at the shelves and report the price tags back to Google. So compared to this little funny thing called the web, that digital world, now measuring up the physical world and giving people a little bit in exchange for that, namely maybe some product information or the fact that they could buy the item more cheaply at Amazon, is a very low price to pay compared to measuring out the universe weighted by the interest, by the attention of people. So now I want to go with you. And I want you to come with me and just imagine one thing. Rather than being stuck anywhere and worrying about specific data or specific APIs, I want you to imagine you had all the data in the world freely available at your fingertips. What would you do? What would you do, in the spirit of our previous speaker, to make the world a better place? That's every TED Talk has to have that in it. Or at least if you are a company, as most of you are working for, what would you do to delight your customers? Think for a moment, if you really had, after this build-up, including Google Glass, all the data in the world, freely available at your fingertips, what would you do? So if anything to share, probably tweeting it in here to Caroline is the right way, and we'll pick it up in the conversation. When I work with companies, this is a very good question, because it takes off all those problems which in a pre-API world, siloization, etc., people really loved to talk about, the funny world, the stories they lived in. And I think with this question, you can really, in your organization, move the conversation to the next level and say, assume we had APIs for everything. What actually would you do with it? So in many cases, it's no longer a problem about the data set. In many cases, also no longer a problem about the tool set or even the skill set. But it is a question about the mindset. Having the consumer perspective I like to use the term give to get, give data to get data, for instance, as the underlying principle. In an earlier talk today, we heard the example that developers in some way don't like to fill out long forms with lots of irrelevant crap in them in order to get the one thing back, because they have other ways of finding it. All the power to them. And the amazing thing is that many of us, developers or not, continue to actually evolve in a way where we are clear about give to get. That I'm very happy to share my geolocation, for instance, if I actually get something in exchange. And that mindset shift, that companies have to come to grips and ask questions like, do your customers understand the value they get when they give you data? Or the question, does your product or service get better over time with data, or does it get worse? Those are the mindset questions which I think organizations need to ask. I also want you to think about, where do you actually think that your bottlenecks lie? What stands between you and building that app, or between you and having someone build that app for you that accesses data that are somewhere out there? Maybe not in your organization, maybe somewhere else, or that creates incentives for people to give you those data. What stands between you and them? The economics of data, the economics of access to data, the economics of services has dramatically shifted. So what is the bottleneck? I think in many cases, it is people's imagination, or it's people's fears that by knowing what the data is, by knowing what some metrics are, they might not be looking as good as they hoped they would be looking. One of the Amazon principles is, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And I think that's a great principle, because that way it is really your imagination which limits you, and not that you think your boss might not like what you're doing. The other thing which I think limits us when we're talking about the data of individuals is our notion of the identity of the individual. Let's take the business model shift from non-social business models, Craigslist being one example, anon, some, to social business models. In this case, a couple of blocks away from here, Airbnb. Another example, of course, we heard about Uber, Lyft, and others, rideshare, sidecar, examples where you now interact with others based on APIs, that the person who picks me up with a Lyft, they have my Facebook pic on their app. I know their pic in their car. So suddenly in this world where we try to anonymize things by scraping things, by making all hotel room look the same, and all the preferences we elicited from people was their pillow preferences. We now live a world where actually individuals can live and individuals can shine. Looking back 20 years ago, you have seen that cartoon. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Now it is on the internet, everybody knows you're a dog. So, in summary, I would like to leave you with 4 rules. 4 rules for APIs in a data-rich world, where I think it is people's imagination that is the limiting part. 1, start with a question, not with the data. So many companies come and say, look, Andreas, we have all this data. What can we do with it? And I always have the same answer back to them. Well, why don't we start with something you want to do? And then figure out how can we get the data that actually help you. That flip is the amazing thing that happened the last few years. Second rule, focus on metrics that matter to your customers, not to your lawyers or to your accountants. So rewriting the equations of business in customer-centric terms is a very, very deep shift. Not that many companies actually really have adopted, embraced. Let me give you an example. Delivery on promise. So if I say that I promise a package to arrive from Amazon tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, say, do we really track how that is from a customer-centric view? So for instance, if it arrives a day earlier, so if something is promised for tomorrow, Wednesday, and it arrives today, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Bad thing. I live in an apartment complex here where we have no doorman. If I get home, there's a piece of paper there that I can drive to San Bruno and pick it up. Bad thing. So as you know, in this API-driven world, we can actually look at how these things happen in real time. We actually are much better shape now to control this, and writing it from a customer-centric perspective, which means that you are worse off if it arrives a day early than the day you promised it for. Of course, it's worse if it arrives a day late than it arrives a day early. So what strategy now is having a mindset of these customer-centric terms and writing them down, realizing where you make mistakes and fixing them. But expressing it as a customer-centric perspective where things matter to your customers is the second rule. Third one came up a bunch of times today, and then somewhere I'm probably preaching to converted here, to focus on actions and feedback. Do stuff and see how it's doing, measure how it's doing, as opposed to McKinsey-like cover your ass and long reports and analytics and stuff like that. And the fourth one is very close to my heart. Create that symbiosis between people and computers. So let people do what people are good at, and computers do what computers are good at. Try not to confuse the two.